Hello, my name is James Knox. I'm Curator Emeritus of the Fleming Collection, which in conjunction with Dovecot Studios in Edinburgh has put on this exhibition, the Scottish Colourists' Radical Perspectives. And today I've rounded up a veritable posse of professors of international renown in art history who have come to tell me about their favourite works in this exciting show. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Thomson, who is Professor of History of Art at Edinburgh University. He is also an internationally renowned expert on French 19th and early 20th century paintings. A hallmark of his renown and scholarship is that he was the first foreigner to sit on the curatorial committee of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. So now, Richard, I would like to ask you, why have you picked this particular painting? And perhaps you could start by giving the artist and the subject.
Well, this is a painting by the American artist James McNeill Whistler, who was actually working in London in the 1860s for the rest of his career. Although this is a painting actually painted on a trip to Chile. It represents the harbour at Valparaiso in Chile, painted in 1866. And it's a fascinating painting because it shows how important Whistler was going to be for artists of later generation, simply because of how he could simplify pictures. Here is his motif of a crowded harbour. We see lots of ships in it, but there's nothing particularly that identifies it as Valparaiso. You get a sense of how the picture is painted coming out very strongly, what interested him. The darkest forms are the hulls of the ships in the relative foreground. The most emphatic shapes are those sails, again in the foreground. As you move back into the picture, things become simplified. In the foreground, the surface of the sea is very calm, but it's painted on a slight diagonal. That gives a little element of interest to that open foreground. But as you move back, as your eyesight moves back into the picture, you see the water becomes more horizontal, and that matches the clouds in the sky. And it's that simplification of effect, of colour, of value, relative lightness and darkness, and overall simplification, getting to the bare essentials of the motif, that was very important in Whistler's work and a great influence on later generations.
And in particular, Richard, on the Scots, who were very early advocates of Whistler's art, weren't they?
Indeed. Whistler was much admired in Scotland. Of course, he painted the famous portrait of Thomas Carlyle, the great Scottish historian. And in the end, a large amount of his paintings, the remains of his studio, was donated to the University of Glasgow, where it's splendidly on view. So that Scottish connection was very important. But in the meantime, after his death in the early 20th century, he was hugely admired by artists in France and all over Britain, including the Scottish artists.
Now, Richard, I must ask you, given your hugely distinguished international career as an art historian, can you name one of the exhibitions that you've curated that you're most proud of?
I suppose that's got to be the Monet retrospective that was held at the Grand Palais in Paris at the end of 2010 into 2011. I was phoned up by Guy Cocheval in my office at Edinburgh University. He just said, we've got to do a Monet exhibition. I want you to do it. You will choose it. You will structure it. And we will do whatever you say. What an invitation that was. And I worked with some curator colleagues at the Musée d'Orsay, and the exhibition was a huge success and was seen by over 900,000 people and opened 24 hours a day for the remaining last weeks of the exhibition. So it pleased a lot of people and showed Monet, I hope, at his best, and that was important.
Now, Richard, you've chosen a second painting in this exhibition. What is it? Who is it by, and what is it?
It's by Harold Gilman, a member of the Camden Town Group. And it represents a small town in Norway called Flekkefjord, which Gilman visited around 1912, 1913. Gilman liked to travel right at the beginning of his career. He'd even worked in North Africa. But what's interesting about this picture is that by 1910 his work had really transformed from being a rather plain Slade School trained tonal painter at the beginning of his career to somebody who was looking at continental French art, or art from France of a recent period. And one of the artists who particularly interested him was Vincent van Gogh. And in his family's collection, they had albums of reproductions of Van Gogh's work, which were produced by a German company. Hard albums with plate-sized black and white images in them. And Gilman owned a couple of those. And it's clearly from them that he learned about Van Gogh's type of composition. He couldn't learn so much about the colour, but composition, and I think also brushwork.
How would he have known about the colour?
He would have been able to see some pictures in London when they came over for exhibitions like Fry's post-impressionist exhibitions of 1910 and 1912. But I think one of the reasons why he went to Flekkefjord and to Norway perhaps was because of the colour. You know, perhaps he knew from guidebooks and things that the houses were painted in bright colours, and the composition of this with its lifting bridge recalls the Langlois bridge that Van Gogh had painted in Arles in the early summer of 1888. So I think there is a compositional echo as well as a chromatic one with Van Gogh's work. But I think what was particularly important for Van Gogh, for Gilman, was not just the colour but how it was applied. Although Gilman used his own touch, and this is a dabbed and slightly patterned touch which is different from the more marked and agitated stroke that Van Gogh used. His willingness to make the surface count is something that he learned from Van Gogh, and that's what's important. And when one looks at the bridge at Flekkefjord here, yes, one is struck by the striking colour. One is also aware of the complicated drawing there, because the perspective of that lifting bridge with its timbers and girders and so on is complicated. But it's the surface that is so important and animates the picture.
Do you think it stands in its own right as a really interesting painting, this, despite being totally absorbed in the art of Van Gogh?
Oh, I think it goes beyond Van Gogh. I mean, I think this is not derivative. What I've been talking about is an artist who had looked at the example of Van Gogh, but was very much his own man. And for a painting done by a British painter around 1912-13, this was a very exciting and adventurous work.
And of course it does connect to the Scots, although tangentially, in that the Scots were also greatly influenced by Van Gogh at this time.
And people like Ferguson were looking at Van Gogh's painting and producing work in parallel to this. Yes. Gilman was not necessarily aware of an artist like Ferguson, nor vice versa, but there was a parallel instinct to look at that recent French and in Vincent's case Dutch painting and to learn from it and be stimulated.
And Gilman died young, didn't he?
Gilman died in the Spanish flu epidemic in 1919.